Why Japan went ahead of India even though they had similar starting points after World War II. Is this a real comparison, or we need to understand that they had very different starts? In 1947, India had just won freedom and Japan was devastated by a war. Its cities were bombed by nuclear bombs. And both of these countries stood at a crossroad. But one of them only were able to take off, and there are no guesses there. But the question is this comparison really fair? Because this comparison is way more complicated than just the numbers that are presented in front of us. Today we will be looking into all of that. Hello everyone, welcome to Vajiram and Ravi's Flash News. My name is Shubhangi Singh, and today we are going to understand that what were the reasons that even after standing at similar crossroads, both India and Japan, it was only Japan that was able to take off and grow almost at the 3x pace of India back in 1950s. And when we talk about this comparison is a little skewed, it is a little biased because we need to look more than the numbers. So let us start with understanding the story of the 1950s. When we talk about the 1950s, it was on 15th August 1947 that India finally got freedom after almost 200 years of colonial rule. When we look at India of that particular time, we will get to see that all the infrastructure was skewed only for colonial extraction. If we talk about agriculture, the output was minimal, productivity was abysmal, and at the same time, if we talk about the methods that were used, they were traditional. When we talk about industries, negligible presence, and when we talk about service sector, it did not exist at all. If we talk about next, the literacy rate that existed in India at that given point of time, it was merely 16%, and if we look at the female literacy rate, it was below 8%. Even though it seemed like a moment, big moment for the Indian economy where the road ahead seemed very promising, at that very same time, another economic and political setback was seen by India, that was the partition itself. Now, all of this made that particular time like just a starting point where India was probably not just starting from zero, but negative markers. And a similar story is seen for Japan. When we talk about Japan, a small island nation in the Pacific Ocean, it was defeated in the World War II, which used to be an imperial power before World War II. It had finally succumbed because of the nuclear bombings that had taken place, and this economy was devastated. When we look at the time when we are talking about 1945, the end of World War II, and 1950s, we see the defeat of Japan had given it a major setback, and it seemed to be starting from the very point that I am talking about, the starting point. So it was also at the similar crossroad just like India was. But another differentiation, like when I told the story of India, you have to see when we are talking about Japan, the literacy rate looked very different. When we are talking about the colonial exploitation, the colonial existence in India for 200 years, Japan had not seen such a thing. It was this war that affected and put a setback on Japan. But if we talk about industrialization, then we see that it was very much ahead of India even before the war. If we talk about the GDP at that time, it was somewhere around $200 per capita, and when we talk about for India, it was merely $59. We have to understand the difference in this particular comparison because this already gives us an insight that when we are talking about the crossroads, even though the starting point seemed very similar, that Japan got a setback and India had just won the freedom and they were at the same starting line, but at the same time, the advantages that Japan had, that were not present with India. For example, if you look at the literacy rate, by 1950, 43.8%, almost 43.8% literate population was present, and if you talk about basic primary and secondary education, it was more than 50% for Japan. The industrialization had already taken place since the 1800s through the Meiji Restoration, which catalyzed Japan's modernization, and it also gave a movement even after the setback that we saw in Japan. Now that we have known the story of both sides and understood the point at which they stood, now let us look into the reasons what helped Japan. So the first thing we have to understand that how did human capital affect their economic growth. So if we talk about Japan, especially in the context of literacy and education, they were the focal points of the Meiji period if we talk about from the 1800s itself. If we look at the mean years of schooling, it rose from basically 2.0 in 1900. By 1950, it was 6.7, from 2 years to 6.7 years. That means in terms of literacy and the development of human capital, Japan seems to be holding a higher hand because the workforce that was present with them was skilled and trainable for industrial revival. Even though war put a setback, but it was more like a constructive destruction where you have the skill and you wipe the slate clean to create better things. But at the same time, when we look at Indian aspect, we get to see that it was colonial neglect, colonial exploitation that saw underinvestment in terms of education. Literacy rate was abysmal, there was poor access to quality education, and human capital, basically this bottleneck persisted for decades even after independence. We could not get off the setback that we had seen in the 200 years of colonial Raj. Now, even if you see at the recent human capital index that came out last in 2020, at present India is ranked at the 100th number and Japan holds the position of 5th. So this also clearly demarcates that even after years of independence, we are facing the issue in terms of human capital formation. Even though at this point of time, the race between India and Japan has changed, India is overtaking Japan in many contexts, but we have to look back at 1950s to understand that what kind of advantage Japan enjoyed. If we talk about another aspect where Japan went ahead, it was the geopolitical help. So what do we mean when we talk about geopolitical help? So when we understand the geopolitical angle, we have to see that US, after it won on the side in terms of World War II, it gave a strategic support to Japan. It was responsible for all the defense spending and army at the end of Japan, and it was a very strategic move by US to have an ally, especially so close to Soviet, and facilitate them. And that advantage was enjoyed by Japan. How come? Because if US covered all the defense costs, it allowed the country to focus and channel all funds into development. Furthermore, with the help of US, they had access to the US market, which helped their export orientedness, and it also helped in terms of gaining advanced technology. Furthermore, it was US only that facilitated special procurements, especially during Korean War, when we are talking about 1950 to 53, which actually ignited the export boom of the export-oriented industry that we see in Japan. But the picture in India was absolutely the opposite when we talk about in terms of geopolitics, because India decided in the bipolar world to not side in terms of the Cold War era. They decided to be the founding member of non-alignment movement, and that is why they had limited large-scale any strategic support. Other than that, there was no equivalent. If we talk about as per the size of US and Japan relation, there was no equivalent support or economic or technological boost that was seen in India. Now we have understood two parameters. First we have talked about human capital, then we have talked about geopolitical angle. Now we will be moving into the third angle, that is domestic policies. What were the domestic policies that both of the country decided to choose? When we talk about India, we have to remember that it was initially socialist leaning because of the political leadership that we have at our end, and it had a centrally planned economy. Furthermore, it was plagued with issues like license raj, it had import substitution issues and state dominance in key sectors. Even after trying our best, our average GDP growth was absolutely sluggish and it remained somewhere around 3.5%, which is also referred to as Hindu rate of growth. Now you have to understand, I'll throw in a question here, why do you think this number is called as the Hindu rate of growth? What is the logic behind labeling it as the Hindu rate of growth? But when you look at Japan, it was a different dynamic that was being followed in terms of domestic economic policy. It was not state controlled, it was market friendly, and it had an export oriented model which was focused on. Furthermore, strategic industries which could help them in leveraging and increasing GDP, they were promoted, and global integration was focused instead of protection. So protection was the key reason that we went for state dominated industry. In Japan, that was not the focus. The idea was rather promotion. And if you look at the average GDP growth, especially in 1960s, it went over 10%. That clearly shows that there was a marked difference in terms of growth because of the domestic policies as well. Now moving to the next factor, that what was the effect of societies and the people who were present there. When we talk about development, an important component comes from the population itself, that we already know, but we have to understand the demographic and what are the indicators associated with it matter a lot as well. So when we look at India, we find highly diverse population, and at the same time the population was increasing. It was way higher as compared to Japan. It had a very large rural base which led to developmental challenges, and it enhanced those challenges by inequality as well as regional balance. So when we look at the population of India, it was not only increasing by that time, because if we took a look at 1951, we are almost very close to 400 million. And at this very same time, this population was heterogeneous. It was not homogeneous. We celebrate our diversity, be it regional, cultural, religion. And at the same time, when we talk about Japan, Japan had a homogeneous population and a smaller population. As compared to 400 million at our end, there were only 83 million in 1950s with Japan. And they had comparatively better social cohesion as compared to us, where we had stark inequalities and other differences. This cohesion helped them to achieve their national objectives way better. Now, based on these parameters, I hope you have a fair idea that yes, Japan did have advantages and it did make a miraculous growth after the setback. But at the same time, when we are talking about the parameters, I am sure you have got a fair idea about the fact that how this comparison, even the starting points, they are very different for India and Japan. If we take another factor when we are talking about the societies as well, we have to look into the factor that in terms of a newly born democracy, it was very difficult to align the parties work on the similar interest, whereas it was different for Japan, it was easier for Japan. So when we look at these aspects, do we really get to understand that Japan's growth was truly as miracle as we are making it sound? Yes, it was definitely phenomenal, because the industrial output, if we consider, it went from almost 27% in 1946, that is just after the World War II, to 350% in 1960s itself. So in the span of 15 years, there has been tremendous growth. But the benefits came from the stable institution, efficient governance, external support, and tech adoption. Furthermore, the high savings rate of the economy also supported capital formation. In India, we did not have all of these. But if we talk about India at that very same end, we continued to struggle with the basic industrialization. We had to manage the rural poverty. We had to ensure something as basic as food security. And that is why our GDP growth happened to be as low as 0.2%, especially in the worst phases of planning when we encountered war as well. So where Japan was getting stability, we were fighting at our neighborhood fronts. We had to manage the internal policies. We had to see phases like emergency, and even after that, we have come out standing strong. And that is what brings me to my question, that when we are talking about India's starting point and Japan's starting point, and we always make this comparison that Japan went 3x ahead, we have to understand that India's starting line was very different, and it was much lower than as compared to Japan. Reason being, we had the colonial legacy, we had the colonial exploitation, and we had suffered not only deindustrialization but poor investment, be it in education, health, infrastructure. There were recurrent famines, food security was absent, there was mass poverty, and fragmented government structures. The country was starting from scratch. Our country was starting from zero. But Japan knew what to do. They had the capital formation, they had the knowledge, they had the human capital, they had the savings as well. So at the same time, Japan came in with the pre-war strength at their hand, but India did not have any of this advantage. And that is what I have been trying to highlight, that is it fair to compare when we are talking about India and Japan's growth, when we are saying in 1950s they were at the similar point. So now I would like to leave at this question, do you really think that it is a fair comparison, especially at this time when we are seeing that India is going ahead of Japan in many terms? So what are those terms where we are going ahead of Japan, and what do you think of this comparison? I am leaving you with this picture of 1950s where people were going to parliament on bicycle in our capital, whereas the capital of Japan, Tokyo, looked something like this. That was all from my side. Thank you so much.